All right, so we are live, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And of course, there are no classrooms right now. We're all stuck at home, so we so appreciate you continuing to join us as we highlight amazing science, exploration, and facilities from around the globe. Today, I am particularly excited because we are diving back in at the Phillip Currie Dinosaur Museum in Northern Alberta. So we are behind the scenes today, and we're going to learn about some really cool fossils that have never before been shown in any education program. So I'm personally very excited. I also want to note, in addition to taking questions on YouTube, that we have a Slido presentation for today. So you can go on Slido, you can share questions, you can upvote your favorites, take part in interactive polls and quizzes. So if you go to Slido, I'll link this in the chat bar on YouTube. You can use the event code Dino, and that'll get you access to the presentation. All right, without further ado, we are joined by Nick Carter at the museum. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nick, and take us away.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. Always great to be part of these sessions. And as you said, we are behind the scenes at the Phillip J. Currie Dinosaur Museum. This room that I'm standing in is kind of a big sort of cavernous area. This is what I like to call our fossil library. The technical word for it is the fossil collections. So with most museums, the stuff that you see on display isn't actually sort of the main part of what the museum collects. It's just stuff that they want to show off. The vast majority of what a museum actually has is kind of tucked away in the back, where it's kept safe and cataloged and stored so that people can access it for, doing science, or if, we want to put other things on display, kind of change stuff up, we can take stuff out of here. So this is our big fossil collection back here. And what I wanted to show off is some things that I've never shown off before, and specifically dealing with one particular site that we talk about a lot at the museum, but, sort of get a bit of a different focus on it. So as many of you might know, this museum, the Currie Museum, is up in northwestern Alberta. We're in the town of Wembley, which is just outside Grand Prairie, which is about 4.5 hours northwest of Edmonton. And up here, the rock is from the late Cretaceous period. And one of the best sites that we have for dinosaurs up here is a bone bed, which is kind of like a big dinosaur graveyard. And it's at this spot called Pipestone Creek, which is basically just a creek that flows through this wooded area. And there's all these Cretaceous exposures at the site that yield all sorts of dinosaur bones. So the main kind of dinosaur we find there, and I'll show you some fossils of it in a little bit, is of a big horned dinosaur that looks a bit like Triceratops, but it's different. It's called Pachyrhinosaurus. You might be familiar with Pachyrhinosaurus from the Walking with Dinosaurs movie. But we don't just have Pachyrhinosaurus there. We actually have the remains of an entire ecosystem at Pipestone. So it's kind of allowed us to fill in sort of the gaps in our knowledge of what we know about life about 73 million years ago. So I'll start with some of the smaller but not uninteresting things, and we'll kind of work our way up to some of the bigger animals. Now, for any ecosystem, modern or extinct, you need plants. And we have good evidence of some of the types of plants at the Pipestone Creek bone bed. And obviously, northwestern Alberta back then was very different than it was today. There were still lots of plants and things like that, but they were kind of different. So one thing we sometimes find at this bone bed, sort of amongst the jumble of dinosaur bones, are the seeds of plants. And you have to have a really sharp eye to actually find a plant seed. It's kind of unbelievable to think about. But here I have, you can see just how tiny this is. Hopefully that focus is okay. This is a tiny little plant seed. I guess, by some standards, it's not terribly small compared to some other plant seeds. It's about the size of a pumpkin seed, kind of a similar shape, but that came from a plant. So what we think happened at this site was, some kind of storm came in and washed up all these dinosaurs, as well as trees and other things like that. It all got kind of washed out across a floodplain and buried together, and some surprisingly fragile stuff sort of got preserved in this big jumble of bones. So you might have also heard of amber, which is that stuff that they used in Jurassic Park, with the mosquito inside, and they kind of drilled into it and got the dinosaur DNA out of it. So that unfortunately isn't really a scientific reality yet. But amber is actually a thing. And The Pipestone Creek bone bed is one of the few places in the entire world where dinosaur bones and amber are found in the same place. Normally, you either find one or the other, but here we find them together. So I have to be very careful with this because amber is very small, easily lost, delicate stuff. But here I've got a little piece of amber. So up here, you're not finding those big chunks with, an entire bug in it. You're finding just little bits of it. You can see that little trail of stuff in this paper towel. That's actually amber. Now, some amber that we find at the site is, like a breadcrumb, but some stuff we found is, about the size of my little fingernail, which isn't really all that bad. Now, do we find anything in this amber? Yes, we actually do. Not entire, huge bugs or anything like that, but we're working together with some researchers, including some friends at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum who specialize in amber, and they have a study coming out soon on amber from this bone bed, which contains all sorts of little stuff that we normally would never find. So I can't tell you too much about the results, but I know they found quite a variety of insects and other things like that. So we know what kind of bugs were hanging around with these dinosaurs and some other little bits of small-ish animals. So hopefully this paper will be out soon and we can talk more about it. But up until then, all I can say is we do find stuff in our amber, and it's telling us a lot about the little tiny animals that lived in this area. We can also tell kind of what the climate was like based off this amber. So we know that it was, kind of a warm climate, on average, definitely warmer than it was today, kind of comparable to the southeastern United States along the Mississippi River, places like that. Not quite tropical, but, not quite cold and often dreary like it is for a lot of the year here. Now, one common misconception about amber is that it comes from, tree sap, and that's sort of technically the case. It's actually tree resin, which is this kind of gluey, sticky stuff that you can sometimes see oozing out of trees today. So if a tree falls over and gets buried, the tree itself could turn into petrified wood, and if that hardened amber or that hardened resin gets buried as well, it can change into amber. And if something got trapped inside while it's still soft, it can indeed be fossilized in there. So let's take a look at some other stuff that we find. Now, the main dinosaur that we find at this site, of course, is, like I said, Tyrannosaurus. And we've got thousands of bones from hundreds, if not thousands, of animals. Now, most of these bones are quite jumbled up and, kind of broken and have come apart. One thing I'll show you is this. This is part of a jawbone from a young Pachyrhinosaurus. It wasn't a baby, but it wasn't nearly fully grown either. So this is kind of the part where it would kind of stuck up like that into the top of the jaw, and this is where the tooth row would be. And you can see it's got this characteristic kind of chocolatey brown color to it. If you saw it lying on the ground, you might think somebody threw away a weirdly shaped chocolate bar or something. But that's kind of typical for bones from Pipestone Creek. And they get that color from the sediment that they were buried in. So these dinosaurs were buried in quite dark brownish sort of like soil kind of stuff. And that sort of seeped into the bones and turned them from white to this color that you see here. Put that back. Now, when a fossil comes out of the ground, it doesn't really look like that. We put it in one of these. So this is a plaster jacket that was collected from Pipestone in 2018. So what we do when we collect these things is there's a little card you can see right here. All the data is written down on it. And that tells us, what was found, where it was found, who found it. And this is just burlap soaked in plaster so that if, you drop it, it's relatively hard and, the bone inside is protected. Sometimes we just do sort of a half jacket. So as you can see, it doesn't exactly look pretty. There's all sorts of rock and dirt and stuff like that clinging to this fossil, and I can't even tell what this is, so it needs to be prepared, which just means kind of cleaned up and glued back together so that we can figure out what the heck it is. And then when that's all cleaned up, it'll go into this permanent storage right here. Back. So some stuff we find there can be pretty sizable. This is a piece of a frill from a Pachyrhinosaurus. So they had that big Triceratops type frill coming out of the back of the neck. Now, it's kind of hard to see, but you might be able to tell that the frill is not actually very thick. Some paleontologists used to think that this structure was to protect the back of the animal's neck from, Tyrannosaurs or things like that, things that might try to eat it. But, the Tyrannosaur could bite right through that. But you have probably seen on some horned dinosaur frills at the back of their skull that they have these spikes or knobs sticking out, and that's what these things are right here. So these are separate bones that grow on the edge of the frill, and then as the animal ages, they actually fuse onto the edges of the frill. And this is a really useful way of identifying what kind of horned dinosaur you have, because sometimes their skulls look kind of similar, but if you've got most of a frill, you can kind of piece together what you've got. So I'll put this back. Okay. And there's all sorts of other cool stuff we find here. This is a neat one I featured somewhat recently on our social media, but I'll show it off in person as well because it's really neat. Just put this jacket right over here. And this tells us a lot about sort of what it's like to become a fossil. So what I've got here is a vertebra, a backbone from a Pachyrhinosaurus. So this lower part here is sort of the main body of the vertebra, and then these parts sticking off to the side, and then there would be this part here sticking out of the top. But as you can see, this is super skinny. This is a really thin bone side to side. And the reason for that is if you're a bone and you get buried by tons and tons of rock and dirt, literally tons, eventually you're going to get squashed. So this bone used to be quite a bit thicker, sort of front to back, but over time, it just gets kind of squashed and deformed. So one thing paleontologists have to kind of work at is figuring out what they're seeing in a fossil is the result of what the animal actually looked like, and what things are the result of the process of fossilization. It's the study that we call taphonomy, how things fossilize. One interesting thing as well about this vertebra is it's got this weird bony projection right here. I'll see if I can hold that up and show it off a bit clearer. So this thing that's just sticking out really weirdly like that. And as you can see from the surface of the bone right here, it's quite pitted and kind of has a gnarly texture to it. So these things can be kind of hard to tell, but it looks like this dinosaur had some weird bone growth happening in its vertebra, at least this one, if not more of them. So this could be a sign of some kind of illness or disease in this dinosaur. So dinosaurs got sick and got attacked by things like parasites and things like that, and even got cancer and things like that, just like humans and modern day animals do. So we can see evidence of things like that in their bones sometimes. Put this back. And here I've got, this is also from a Pachyrhinosaurus, but look how tiny it is. It's just from a little baby one. It's a little baby dinosaur vertebra from the tail. So, this tells us that these animals, they lived in herds together. And it seems like a lot of dinosaurs didn't do this, sort of like, have the babies sort of live alongside the adults for, an extensive period of time. But at least this type of dinosaur seems to have done that. There are some growth stages of this dinosaur that are less common at the site. So the thought is maybe the babies lived with the herd, kind of hanging out with their parents or maybe just kind of intermingling. And then when they became teenagers, and as teenagers do, they get kind of ornery and kind of wanting to, live their own life and not be told what to do by mom and dad anymore. So they kind of would take off on their own. And we've got some areas, like I've mentioned in a previous session, where we just find teenage dinosaurs at a particular deposit. And then when they got old enough to have their own kids, they would sort of rejoin a herd and, circle of life from that point on. Let's go through these drawers and see what else I've got. One really common thing we find here is ribs. So here is a fairly typical piece of a Pachyrhinosaurus rib. And ribs are such common bones to find because dinosaurs have a lot of ribs. Ribs and vertebrae, we've got lots of those things as well, whereas we only have one skull. So, less common to find that. I'll show you this thing right here. So check this out. We were talking about deformed bones and bones that showed signs of illness or injuries. Check out this rib. Look at that bend to it. That's pretty weird. Whether that's deformation from being fossilized, or whether this Pachyrhinosaurus had a broken rib, who knows? I would say if you look at the texture of it pretty close, seems to be a lot of scratches. It's got quite a gnarly texture to it. So my guess would be this animal actually had a broken rib that healed in this really weird crooked shape. Probably would have been pretty painful. I would not have wanted this to happen to me. But this tells us that dinosaurs lived pretty, hard, intense lives and had to just deal with injuries. They didn't have doctors or anything like that to sort of take care of them. So I got this one right here. All right, let's delve deeper. Look at some other cool stuff. Lots more ribs. Here's a really big rib. Imagine the size of the animal that left this behind. That would make quite the feast of ribs at a barbecue, I think. Imagine all the meat you could get off that. Right. I have to be very careful when putting things back because obviously they're pretty fragile. Here's some more cool stuff. Another thing, obviously, we often find is bones from the hand and the foot, because you've got lots of fingers and toes, even if you're a dinosaur. So here is a bone from the foot, and again, here I'll show you a more normal one, so you can compare. Here's a slightly more typical foot bone. You can see it's got kind of almost a club shape to it. So these dinosaurs had really, thick, gnarly foot bones, but then some of them would grow kind of weird like this. Now, obviously it's been broken and probably broken, after the dinosaur died and was fossilized, but it's got kind of a weird bend to it like that. You can see that doesn't look very natural. So it's definitely not uncommon to find horned dinosaurs and other types of dinosaurs with weird diseases and breaks and infections in their foot bones. So you can imagine walking around on that not be very pleasant. Here's what a Pachyrhinosaurus toe bone looks like. So this would be at the very tip of the toe. And you might be able to see the texture there is quite pitted. And that tells us that there was a hoof at the end of this foot, kind of like you would get in a cow or a horse. So they walked on these big flat toes, and you can see just how flat it is, right? So not terribly thick. And that tells us that, we used to think that a lot of dinosaurs lived in and around water, and that they spent a lot of their time, kind of swimming around like, manatees or things like that, or that they just kind of lounged around all day, kind of like hippos. But these foot bones and these toe bones tell us that these were actually animals that were really well adapted to life on land. So I'll put this back where it came from, as well as these. And I'll get to some slightly more entertaining subjects.
Cool. And then Nick, in about 5 minutes or so, if you want to dive in with Q&A, that would be cool. And then if there's anything else that jumps to mind when we're doing that you want to share with us, fantastic.
Awesome. That is a perfect amount of time. So where you find, whoops, in here, there we go. Where you find big herbivores, you're also going to find predators, obviously. Here I've got an inconspicuous looking little bone, which I believe I may have shown off before. But this is a piece of a skull bone from a raptor, a dromaeosaur that we call Boreonicus, would have looked a lot like Velociraptor. So that's kind of a rare thing to find at the site. But another cool thing we find is remains of tyrannosaurs. And here I've got a wonderful tyrannosaur tooth still embedded in the rock that it came from. So might not look terribly big, but it's very well preserved. You can kind of see on the edges here, it's actually serrated. And it's still got quite a pointed tip to it. So obviously it was lost while the animal probably was scavenging at the site, feeding off the dead pachyrhinosaurs because the root of the tooth isn't attached to the tip. And I've got another cool thing to show off, kind of a last bone before we get to Q&A if you like. And this is also from a Tyrannosaur. It's not from this area though. It's from southern Alberta, but you know, the Tyrannosaurs that lived up here would have, you know, had bones just like this. This is a finger bone. And this is one that I actually prepared myself. And it took a really long time, and here's why. You might be able to see, hopefully, but the inside of this bone, there's a hole right there, and you can kind of see right through it. It's actually hollow on the inside, just like a bird's bone. So even Tyrannosaurs had very bird-like bones. And you can see it's got all sorts of glue and stuff still clinging to it. I had to use a lot of glue to get this thing back together because every time I kind of put it together piece by piece, it's just a hollow tube that would kind of collapse in on itself, which was pretty frustrating. But I eventually got it back together. So that's some of the stuff that we find at this site, everything from little plant matter to big rhino-like dinosaurs to their predators and beyond. So hopefully that was interesting, and you can get some questions if you like.
Super cool. Thank you so much, Nick, for such an awesome behind-the-scenes tour. Again, this is an area that people do not get to go when they go to the museum. And when most people, regardless of where you are in the world, you go to a natural history museum, you don't get to see these sort of things. This is sort of the fossil library. So we really appreciate the chance to check it out. All right, for questions, in the YouTube chat bar, if you want to type questions, that's perfect. You can also go on Slido. I'm also about to launch the quiz on Slido. So if you're ready for that, I'll do that in about a minute, and you can take part in a few quick little games there. One quick question from Miss Langer, representing her classroom, joining in. She wanted to know, how do you tell that that's a skull bone? You showed us this bit of skull and it's so tiny. What are the features on that say, okay, this is what it's from?
That's a great question. And you really have to know your dinosaur anatomy to figure that out. And what helps is if you have similar animals with the skull, you know, being complete. So then when you find something that looks like this, you can kind of match it up to, you know, a full version that you know, and you can see, okay, I recognize this shape. That's, you know, this part of the bone from the top of the skull of this type of dinosaur. Also, some of the features, like you can see on the bottom side, there's this depression here. So that's actually making room for the inside of the skull, kind of where the brain would be. So looking for little features like that will tell you what part of the body it came from.
There we go. Very cool. All right, on Slido, we got a question from Maria, and she wants to know, how many dinosaurs were there in the world?
How many dinosaurs were there? You know, that's a question that is really hard to answer for a few reasons. Number one, we're never really going to know exactly how many dinosaurs ever lived. And that's because there's whole sort of paleo ecosystems that just didn't get preserved in the fossil record. All we're seeing is sort of little snapshots from various points. It's kind of like, you know, if you were to watch a movie, but you could only look at certain frames from that movie, you wouldn't get the full picture, but you might be able to kind of figure out a little bit of what the movie was about just by looking at a few frames. That being said, we have identified, you know what? I always forget this off the top of my head. I believe it's around uh, 5 to 10,000 types of dinosaur. The exact number escapes me, but I encourage people to look it up for themselves. Um, it's an ever-changing number, though. We're naming new species every day, basically.
Seriously, it's always nice when we highlight dinosaurs, not only to say that, 5 to 10,000 species is nothing. There are 6,000 species of mammals alive on Earth right now. So there's
Oh
so
yeah,
much more to discover.
yeah.
And now, because of teams going to places where they've never gone before in such big numbers, we are finding multiple new species every single year, which is a really, really exciting thing. So
And
glad we
that's one
covered.
of the really exciting things about working here is because this is sort of a prime area for finding new undiscovered types of dinosaurs. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, outstanding, Nick. All right, Julian wants to know, what is the oldest dinosaur bone you have and that you have ever seen in person?
The oldest dinosaur bone that we have, pretty much most of our dinosaur bones that we have here come from the same time period, which is about 73 million years ago. So late Cretaceous. There are rocks up here that are older than that, about 100 million years old. And there are dinosaur footprints known from that time and place, but we don't have any in this room for me to show you. They're in collections elsewhere. But as far as the oldest dinosaur bones I've ever seen, those would probably have to be from the late Triassic, early Jurassic, so about 200 million years old. But there are dinosaurs that are ever so slightly older than that. But we're mostly focused right here on one particular slice of time, that sort of 73 to about 70 million years ago. It's kind of our speciality right now, anyway.
Awesome. That was a good lead into the next question by Mr. Prezio, and he wants to know from Thunder Bay, Ontario, when a fossil gets found, what determines which museum it goes to?
Well, that sort of depends on a lot of things. First off, it depends on who found it and where it was found. So if we were out exploring in an area that we had government permission to look for fossils in, then whatever we found, we would be able to legally collect and bring back to this museum. The way things work in Alberta, if something is found by like an industrial facility for some, like an oil drilling operation or something like that, like sometimes that happens up in Fort McMurray, for example, and they were to find something and report it, the people who would have to go dig that up would be the Royal Tyrrell Museum, because they're sort of the provincial arm of paleontology in Alberta. If a sort of civilian around here, just kind of an amateur fossil hunter, were to find something and tell us about it, and it looked promising, then chances are we'd be able to go out and find that. With other things, in areas that aren't particularly close to any one particular museum, it can kind of vary, really. It's kind of a case-by-case circumstance, but I do know vaguely of some stories in which some people thought they had the rights to, an area to collect a fossil, whereas it was debated by somebody else. But generally, museums, they prefer to collaborate rather than, compete. So it's pretty amicable.
Fantastic. This is fantastic, Nick. I love it. All right, we got time for 3 more questions or so, and some really good questions. Okay. So Maria wants to know, are birds the only living dinosaurs today, and are they dinosaurs? Can you explain a little bit about the status of birds?
Yeah, so birds are 100% dinosaurs. They are as much a dinosaur as T-Rex, Pachyrhinosaurus, everything I've shown you today. Now, the word dinosaur we often think of as, meaning sort of big, extinct, scaly thing. But all that you really need to be a dinosaur is to have the anatomical features inherited from that first ancestral dinosaur. And birds have all of those. And we can see bird-like traits like, the hollow tyrannosaur bones, for example. And the only living animals that have hollow bones today like that are birds. We can find feathered dinosaurs. Birds are the only animals today that have feathers. There's all sorts of other evidence for birds being dinosaurs, and they are the only dinosaurs still alive today. Now, there was lots of little feathery, snippy kind of dinosaurs around, millions of years ago. It's just one particular group of them happened to survive and then diversify. Today, we call them birds. As far as other things like lizards, crocodiles, turtles, etc., they are not dinosaurs. They lived alongside them, but they're related to each other. They're all different types of reptiles. Crocodiles are closer to dinosaurs than lizards and snakes are, but they're kind of their own thing. So hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, that's fantastic. All right, a question from a bunch of people on YouTube, and we have 3 whole live classes tuning in, which is really exciting. And so they want to know, how did dinosaurs die? Clear it up once and for all, or muddy the waters, not sure.
Well, it's not actually as sort of controversial a thing as a lot of people might think. There is always room for doubt in science, so this isn't, chiseled in stone, but the sort of explanation that pretty much every paleontologist is going with until something better comes along, but so far nothing better has come along, is the meteor impact theory, which a lot of you have probably heard of. Kind of a long situation, but essentially what happened is at the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago, a giant meteorite hit the Earth, and we know where it hit. We've got the crater. It's in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, the Chicxulub crater. And several things happened right after it hit. First off, there was a gigantic explosion equivalent to like thousands and thousands, if not millions, of atomic bombs all going off at once. So pretty violent. That was followed by a shock wave. We don't know exactly how far it went, but it, pretty much leveled a lot of North America. That was followed by the spontaneous superheating of the atmosphere. So you had like forest fires spontaneously erupting all over the world, and you had like molten rock raining down from the sky for months and months, if not years. After that all kind of subsided, the volcanic eruptions that were triggered by this, as well as all the debris that was flown into the atmosphere, blocked out the sun. So that had a lot of long-term implications. Basically, plants couldn't grow, and that meant that whatever big plant eaters were around sort of left, couldn't get enough food to eat, which means the big specialized meat eaters couldn't get enough food to eat. So it was pretty much the worst single day in Earth's history to be a living thing. Obviously, it didn't kill everything on Earth, but it killed most of the animals on Earth.
Yep. Is that all? Like, I mean, it seems like you just walked that off. That was a riot. Thank you for that. There's some really, not that you need a further depiction of that, but a lot of great dinosaur books today have a section talking about that day and what it would have been like in the years afterwards. And it's amazing that anything lived at all, not that dinosaurs were wiped out.
And that's the big thing. It's like paleontologists are really less concerned about how dinosaurs went extinct, because we pretty much have a good idea of it. We're way more interested in how everything else survived. And we've got a few theories for things like mammals and birds and crocs, but still trying to iron out those details.
Yeah, fantastic, Nick. Well, I couldn't think of a better last question to wrap with after that exposition. And that is from the Young family. And they always ask, what is your favorite part of your job?
My favorite part of my job is pretty much doing this. Whether it's online or in person or whatever, I really just love, pulling bones out of drawers and showing them off to people and talking about how cool they are and answering people's questions, all of which have been great today. So yeah, this is why I, get up and do what I do.
Well, we so appreciate you joining us today for our 3 live classes. Thanks so much for tuning in. We had some independent families and groups too, so we really appreciate you joining us. Do check out the Phillip J. Currie Dino Museum on social media, their website, and more. They really do fantastic education work. And join us at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. 4+ sessions every single day, social media, YouTube subscriptions, and you can donate to us on our website if you're keen to. Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. We love getting a chance to explore your amazing museum.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Have a nice rest of your day, everyone. Bye for